Welcome to the Humans and Earth podcast. We bring you inspiration and practical resources for healing our planet and ourselves. It's time for soulful contributions that regenerate life on Earth. I'm Shara Arman, a thought leader and teacher who believes we're ready to renew Earth and heal ourselves in the process. You can find our work online at humansandearth.com and on Instagram at schoolhumansearth. I'd love for you to be on our newsletter list and receive our updates on Instagram. Please share our work at the School for Humans and Earth with anyone you think might be interested, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast so that we can include more and more people in the regeneration revolution that I believe is happening on planet Earth. Welcome to today's episode. Welcome back to Humans and Earth. My guest today is Leah Rampy, author of the new book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. After giving numerous presentations on the dangers of impending climate change, Leah Rampy became convinced that something was missing from the conversations. With experience as a teacher, professor, corporate and nonprofit executive, and leadership consultant, she began a decades-long journey to understand what lies beneath our unwillingness to change our interactions with the natural world. Her growing commitment to reweaving soul and earth has been informed by leading over a dozen pilgrimages and many more retreats, extensive reading and research, her own contemplative practice, and the wisdom of the living world. Leah lives in a co-housing community in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, with her husband, David, and they are the parents of 2 adult children. Welcome, Leah. I'm really happy to get to be in conversation with you today.
Oh, Shara, thank you so much, and I'm really happy to be here.
So let's jump in. I enjoyed your book. I definitely recommend it to our readers. And I thought I would start by asking you about this transition point that you experienced and that I just referred to in your bio and you talk about in the book. You share in the book that your work with environmental issues either began or became elevated when you trained as a climate educator, but really deepened when you realized that presenting people with the facts about climate change is usually not enough to change our trajectory. I've had some similar experiences myself that, like for you, led to a tremendous deepening beyond that initial fact-based activism. So I would love for you to tell us more about what you've learned in recent years about what we actually need to do to shift human behavior towards deep care for the natural world, which, as you and probably our listeners know, is also deep care for ourselves because all these relationships are reciprocal.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Shara, for that question. And it's not an easy one or a quick answer, as I'm sure you well know. But yeah, it's it's so hopeful when you start out with information that you want to share, and you think if you can just let people know the real state of the world, that we will all care deeply and immediately jump into action and make significant changes. But you mentioned in your question, it's behavior change. And our behaviors tend to not change so much just because we have new information. So I think the information is important. I think we all need to broaden our understanding of what really is happening among all the beings in our world. it's insufficient, I think, unless we travel from head to heart. And so to me, that's the transition that I became really interested in. You could call it heart, you could call it soul, but this deep connection to the living world around us is so important for us to care enough and be committed enough. And I think begin to understand our own particular calling in this. I don't have to tell you that it can be really overwhelming to us and to every individual who starts hearing the story of both climate chaos and the biodiversity loss, ecosystem loss. Those are so intertwined, they really can't be separated, can be really overwhelming. So then I'm like, I've tried to eliminate plastic in my life and I just can't figure out how to do it, so nothing I do is enough. So I understand when there's a tendency to want to stick our head in the sand, or to just ignore it, try to look away, look at something else. So I think we have to figure out what is ours to do and understand that all of us figuring out what is ours to do is a way to make substantial change, which I think and is also really the work that you do as well in your coaching and teaching, if I understand it correctly.
Yes, and I think you make a good point there about discerning what is ours to do, because I have certainly talked with people, and I've had this experience myself, people who feel so overwhelmed once they get even a sense of the scale of our systemic environmental and human problems, that they then feel an obligation to be the savior and the transformative presence and fix it all. And then they feel really discouraged and paralyzed. And I think that's so complex because, I mean, actually, on the one hand, I think in terms of, our spiritual presence or our energetic presence in the world, we actually all can be the savior and transformative presence. But, that's another topic. In terms of our actual actions, as you said, we really need to discern what can I feasibly do in my personal life, my home life, my community, maybe my volunteering, maybe my profession. And then that's all that you personally can do. You have to encourage other people to discern that as well. What do you say to people who have a sense that there's a lot more to this than just a set of practical problems? Like you mentioned, we need to stop using plastic. Okay, very true. But you and I both know, and I think your book talks about this a lot, that what's way bigger than that is this change within the heart, or the shift in our perception of ourselves as different from or superior to the natural world rather than intertwined with it in a life community. How do you like to talk about that aspect?
Yeah, that I think is so important, Jara. So part of the challenge, I think, with the idea that we've got to figure out something to do, is exactly that sense that it belongs on us is either as individuals or as humans to figure this all out. And that denies the agency and the wisdom, and the animism of the entire earth. So part of the way I think that I figure out what is mine to do is this soul journey that I talk about. It's also listening to the beings all around me. What is being wanted? What is Earth's dream for what needs to happen here? So to the extent that I take it all on and own it, it's another kind of human-centric way of imagining the future that we want and that we think we should manifest. I don't think we even have the capacity to fully imagine the possibilities of the future. And that's where it's so important that it's done in community. I mean, that's as close as we're going to get to being able to expand beyond our past experience and know what, just catch glimmers of what might be possible, and possible beyond our lifetime.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you put it that way. Someone I've interviewed, not on the podcast, but in an online event I did a couple of years ago that some of my listeners might have heard, is Patricia Cota Robles. And I really appreciate her spiritual perspective. And she was saying just that today in her newsletter, that from her perspective of where humans on the planet are, a challenge we need to get over right now is that most humans cannot even begin to imagine how wondrous life on planet Earth could be. That most of us imagine, okay, we solve climate change and things get easier and less scary, but that's setting the bar so, so low. So I love that it was on my mind today, and I love that you drew attention to this need to amp up and expand our creative and joyful sense of, well, what would be wondrous and amazing here. I also just want to highlight for our listeners the way that you noted we need to be wondering what Earth wants for herself. That's a really rich pathway here where we step out of that supposed dominator role and truly work in partnership with the other living beings to find out what their vision of thriving and flourishing is like here. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. Yeah. We're pretty steeped, aren't we, in kind of that cultural tradition of separation and competition. I was just writing before we got on this call about the incredible ways that Earth collaborates and engages. And it's just so fun to look at the number of ways that this Earth is set up to be in relationship with all other beings. Now, that's not to say there is no such thing as competition, but it is to say that competition is not the way. That's not exactly how we are often invited to be in this world. And I think it makes us sad. I think we're lonely because of it. We feel isolated. We just are not connected to the life around us in ways that our soul longs for.
And competition, that framework is anxiety provoking. So I love that you brought this up. Any listeners who have not heard my 2 episodes on my framework of regenerative collaboration can listen to those, because that's a place where I discuss some of the science supporting what you just said, Leah, that, okay, maybe competition exists in nature, but actually recent research in the sciences, especially the biological sciences, is revealing so many astonishing, paradigm exploding examples of amazing collaborations all throughout the natural world. And I think it's so important for us to realize that, because this model of competition, us against other people and us against nature, it's not only really lonely, as you said, but I think it's very anxiety provoking. Whereas my view is we can all take a tremendous deep breath when we realize that we're actually in this incredibly beautiful collaborative system, and all we really have to do is participate in the collaborations. So, that leads me to something else that I wanted to ask you about. We've already started talking about it, but you quote some of my favorite visionary writers who talk about this, from the medieval mystic Hildegard of Bingen to Thomas Berry and Enrique Salmon and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who have done some really, really pivotal writing about relationality, collaboration. Salmon calls it kincentricity, and Kimmerer talks about kinship. So I wanted to invite you to reflect more on that, because maybe it's the most vital thing that human beings need to be giving our attention to right now.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that Thomas Berry and Brian Swim did for us is inviting us back to that cosmic story and to really think of those 13.8 billion years and where we fit into that whole evolution of life, even just taking life on Earth. I mean, we are such a small blimp, right? In that. And yet it's our family tree, right? And we are made, I mean, it's the whole we're made of stardust, we're made of all of the elements. We share DNA. I wouldn't be able to tell you the numbers, but we share such a large percent of DNA with so many different beings on this earth. And somewhere along the line, I don't remember ever learning about that in school.
We didn't.
Yeah. And yet, wow, wow, this is like mind and heart altering to me to really consider all our relatives on this incredible family tree. So that's one way I think that we have to sort of take a giant step back. Not that we can possibly conceive of this time frame or this level of grandness, but it is a way we take a step back and say, I'm a piece of this, and isn't that wonderful that I'm this little leaf on a tree here? Um, and then what is that relationship? What has it been historically? But also, what is it now? The idea that there is any way we could possibly live for more than 5 seconds without all of this bountiful wonder and beauty of the living world, right? I mean, we know we're breathing air that, that has been shared over and over again on this planet. We know we're drinking water that's shared over and over. Uh, I think maybe sometimes it's just so hard um, to wrap our minds around it that uh, we have to. This is why I think it's a heart journey. I think we can get that kind of connection at an open heart level that really our minds can't quite take in. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I actually got to your question.
No, I think that's
So feel
helpful.
free to ask again.
Right. No, I was thinking as you were talking about how earlier you mentioned that we're very steeped, at least in the West and in industrialized countries, we're very steeped in these perceptions of separation, I think is what you said. And I think, what a lot of us are realizing over the last few decades is we're not just talking about tweaks or minor adjustments in human consciousness
Mm,
and ways of living. We need a massive paradigm shift in mind, in heart, in action, and life ways. And of course, a lot of those of us who are Caucasian or living in the West or living in industrialized cultures, we're playing catch up because as authors like Enrique Salmon and Robin Wall Kimmerer and Lila June Johnston and so many others are pointing out, and not only current authors, but also early 20th century authors like Standing Bear, this is something that indigenous peoples around the world have
sure.
always maintained as
Mhm.
a mind, heart, body awareness that, of course, we are here in profound collaborative relationship with the living world. So a lot of cultures are playing catch up right now. And my sense is, and I imagine you see this too, that most people still don't realize the scale of the change that needs to occur in our minds, in our hearts, and in our ways of living. And that doesn't have to be intimidating, but could be really, really beautiful. But it's a it's a very big transition that we need to go through.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe that's part of the challenge sometimes is that it's so big, we would have to change so significantly if we really embraced this sense of oneness, this sense of kinship, all of a sudden we have to give up our lifestyle. We have to give up our dominion over, you know, there's so many ways in which we would have to substantively change that I think it's frightening for most of us to consider that,
Yeah.
and overwhelming as well. But let's just say we really, really wanted to do that. It's not an easy transition for anybody to make who hasn't been steeped in that and who doesn't have models of it. And I think this is why so many of us feel drawn to, Braiding Sweetgrass and Robin Wall Kimmer and others who have written so beautifully about the possibilities, because it does paint the potential for another way of living that um, that has that kind of um, heart longing associated with it. I was thinking about Rebecca Solnit wrote fairly recently about, but what if? What if the change is not about giving up? What if it's a change to something that is more than we could ever imagine, which is what you were saying. That's what you were saying earlier.
To me, that's really important. And I'm glad you brought it up because I've become very concerned about the conversations that paint all of this in a kind of well, I don't want to name any particular tradition in a denigrating way, but anyway, there's an approach to this conversation that, I mean, puritanical is what is coming to mind, but it's an approach that says this is going to be hard and you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices and your life will become more difficult. And I will tell you that I would say most people, lay people who are not deeply engaged with this conversation, whom I talk to, that's their perspective. We can choose between being comfortable or sacrificing ourselves and helping the planet. I think that's a terrible framing, and that we really need to help people see that's not the only choice at all. Because when you think about possibilities for, I mean, there are so many different ways to describe this. I'm kind of hesitating at which avenues to go down. But when you think about possibilities for enhanced human community, or losing our sense of loneliness because we're more connected to one another and nature, or having energy that powers our homes that we don't feel guilty about, or as some people are saying, in your and my lifetime, energy that powers our homes might even become free. So, not only would you not feel guilty about it, but you might not even have to pay much or at all for it. What would it be like to eat food that is grown in healthy soil by people who are paid a living wage and living a good lifestyle? And, this is regeneratively grown food that is nourishing you and the planet. I mean, what the areas I just named are, there a handful of thousands of ways our lives could improve. So feel free to comment more on that if you want to. And then I think I want to talk about some of these ideas that are related about how it can be a very beautiful thing to embrace a different sense of the human role here, not as damaging, but as beneficial. But if you want to comment more on this aspect we were just talking about, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I think you said it very well. I would just add consumerism as a way to kind of numb the pain for lack of connections. There may be other reasons that people are consuming, but I would argue that's one of the major reasons that we need more and we need more and we need more, and none of it satisfies, because it is not the heart connection that we're longing for. It is a way to kind of numb ourselves to I've been in a friend's home who just has Amazon boxes stacking up that she's never opened. And this is a person who you met, if you met, you would say she's incredibly well adjusted and she's a lovely person and she has great family. And, this is not somebody you would be concerned about having lunch with. And yet I'm looking at these Amazon boxes and saying, oh my goodness, there's something that's not right here. And so I just want to add that to um, the there's something else that is inviting us to change beyond the fear that we're going to destroy Earth. I think that we should be really concerned about losing this incredible, rich, vibrant, diverse, beautiful um, sets of ecosystems that we have. And we should be really concerned about having Earth systems out of balance. I'm not saying that. I'm saying and it's also not, we're not doing that for the sake of what? For the sake of so we can keep shopping, you know? So yes, I'm saying amen. That was a really long amen, but I'm saying amen to what you're holding up there, that
Right. And
there's life and beauty and yeah,
we're not trying to stabilize the planet so that we can still have people working in sweatshops to
right,
purchase the things that we're buying when we feel
right.
empty, lonely, and disconnected, etc. So yeah, I think that
Yeah.
is a really, really important point, which takes us back to the overall concept of transformation on a big and deep scale, because almost all of our systems need to really grow and mature in
Mhm.
order for us to truly be a thriving presence on a thriving planet. And maybe this will be wonderful. Maybe it doesn't have to be sacrificial and grim, which again, I think it's that people who are presenting the future in that way are doing a deep disservice to humans on the planet, in my opinion. So let's connect to a way that you discuss this in the book. You quote Robin Wall Kimmerer at one point and her discussion of how instead of seeing the human species as dangerous to Earth and her beings, and instead of talking about ourselves as shameful and misguided and all of these things that come forth in that conversation, we could do really well to adopt this indigenous view of ourselves as important caretakers of the natural world. I was just recently reading with some students Lila June Johnston's essay about this in Paul Hawkins' Regeneration. And I love the work that she's doing. I hope she'll publish her dissertation, but I'm sure it's available if people want to see it, because she's bringing forward some of the anthropological evidence of how Native Americans in North America, and we know this from other continents as well, they were not just wandering around picking berries and killing deer and buffalo as kind of basic hunter-gatherers. They were very carefully tending and managing North American ecosystems. And so that is an example. There can be many examples from many, many cultures, certainly. But what Kimmerer is talking about and what Lila June Johnston is talking about are really beautiful examples of what I think is a sacred and necessary view of the human species as needed here, and
Mhm.
having the option to be a beneficial and nurturing presence.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I'd just love to hear any other thoughts or questions or musings you have on that, because it's feeling to me like something we really need to bring forward for people to consider.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I'm sure you know well the example I'm going to give from Braiding Sweetgrass, and that is Robin Wall Kimmerer's example of two groups of Indigenous people who came to the center to that she runs on Indigenous wisdom to ask which was the better way to help sustain sweetgrass, because they had noticed that there was some of the plots of sweetgrass that were not doing very well. And these two tribes had different ways of collecting sweetgrass. Of course, both of them were following the honorable harvest, not taking more than half, asking permission. But one of them was sort of carefully taking from across an array of sweetgrass, and the other one was more, maybe less carefully, we might judge, pulling out strands of sweetgrass. And um, so they did a study, and three groups, because you had to have a control group. So they had the women from these two tribes harvest the sweetgrass, and one was totally left alone. I tell this a lot at retreats that I lead, and then I say to people, so which do you think was the sweetgrass that was harmed the most? And people inevitably say, if you're rough when you harvest it, that must be the worst. But of course, the punchline is that the sweetgrass that was least healthy was the one that was totally left alone, because the sweetgrass had evolved over generations and generations in relationship with the women of the tribes who picked the sweetgrass, who used it in their baskets and other weavings. And then it gave that grass the opportunity to expand and grow. One simple example. But to me, it's like, this is what we are looking for. Where is that place where we're invited to be in relationship for the well-being of all? And the fact that we have so few intact ecosystems now. I think there's something like 3% that are fully intact and 11% that are functionally intact, something like that. But out of those that really have capacity to support the native plants and animals that have been thriving there, 80% of those are in indigenous territories. Okay, what do we need to learn? Whose feet do we need to be sitting at here? How do we need to humble this idea that we're going to rush in and know exactly how to save the world, and instead listen deeply to the ways in which humans have been interacting with the land, the water, the air, all around us, for that sake of mutual well-being, of mutual thriving.
It is really important. Another example I've seen in the scholarship, and that Lila June brings forward in her essay in Paul Hawkins' Regeneration, is that apparently we have good evidence that the coastal Indians, and I mean, maybe inland Indians, Native Americans in California, were over time very carefully managing the California forests. I think the example that I've seen is relevant to oak forests, and where ever since, Caucasians and, modern America has been in charge of these California areas of land, we've allowed maybe up to 100 oak trees per acre, but the Native Americans knew that that was a fire risk and would prune and manage so that there were more like 10 oak trees per acre.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had food from the oak trees, other species had food. Fires were far less disastrous, and of course were carefully managed. So I think it's a big, exciting area of inquiry right now,
Mm-hmm.
certainly from the perspective of indigenous past and present practices, and also from the perspective, I mean, people could try this out in their own backyards and balconies, just from the perspective of what happens to a given set of plants and insects, whatever little ecosystem you might be tending. What happens when I manage a little more thoughtfully and interact with it more? What happens when I do so less? It's a really interesting area for all of us to be giving our attention to.
Yeah. It reminded me of Suzanne Simard, Finding the Mother Tree. and talking about growing up in a family of foresters. But when she grew up and got her education and went off to become a forester, she could not understand why the trees were not thriving. And it was so apparent that the practices, even in that time, had shifted so dramatically to large-scale industrial plantations from a family foresting kind of business where you had to keep in mind the good of the trees. Because that was your livelihood. And if you were not honoring the trees, you were not going to be able to pass this on to your future generations. When we think industrial scale, then I think our time frame just shifted so dramatically that we lose track of what it might be to support species for the future.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. So another topic that your book discusses and that I think a lot of people are trying to understand right now is how do we balance, there are lots of words we could use, but I'll just say grief and creativity right now, because there are literally probably countless reasons why many people are experiencing grief right now, whether it's over human suffering, the suffering of animals and plants, the suffering of humans, animals, and plants, all in the same context or, problem situation, ecosystem decline, extreme weather, on and on. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that. I certainly don't advocate that we pretend like that's not happening or turn our backs.
Sure.
But I've also become really concerned over time about what seems to me a tendency in our culture in certainly the last couple of decades and ongoing, to over focus on the grief and the sorrow and the despair, which then leads to very negative predictions and a sense of helplessness. And then people are not really engaging with the creative human aspect. I mean, we can even talk about this from a nervous system and neurological perspective, which I've done in some podcast episodes. But it just seems so crucial to me for us to really be discerning right now. How do you balance the sorrow and the grief that might be unavoidable with spending more time in your heart-based joy and your creativity so that you're contributing toward nurturing life and helping turn things in a flourishing direction? So I'd love to hear you speak to your sense of that.
Thank you. So my sense is that part of the antidote to feeling grief, particularly our eco-grief or eco-anxiety, is more time in the living world. That openness to awe and wonder and beauty, which means really re-enlivening our senses, going on a walk, a sit. I mean, it could be in your backyard. It doesn't have to be far, sitting with a tree. Just opening to the awe and wonder and the beauty and the incredible presence of what is there is really healing. There's more and more that's written about that lately. I'm sure you're well aware of all the books that have been out recently on awe. As I read the benefits, and I think, my gosh, if somebody told you that would be found in a pill, you would be signing up right away for that. You're more altruistic, you're more in touch, you're more creative, you're more lively, it's just all sorts of good energy that comes from being in awe and wonder. To do that, though, I think for me, I have to slow down. I have to be intentional to be somewhere in the outdoors. Or I've sometimes said to people with a head of cabbage or an apple that you sit and really look at. I have to take the time. It doesn't have to be hundreds of hours. It could be 10 minutes, but it's a focused attention and openness to, as I said, engage our senses and really be present to what is and let it find you. So that to me is one way that we sustain ourselves and enliven our sense of purpose. I also want to lift up Trebby Johnson, whose work is about going into wounded places and sitting there until you find or make the beauty that's within them. So to me, that's an intriguing possibility to stay with a clear-cut forest until you see that within that remaining trunk, there is incredible beauty and there are whatever it is, sprouts that are coming up. To find those possibilities in brokenness. So I would say both and. It starts with I have in classes, I have people create I have them take out a piece of paper and on one side write all the sorrow and the loss and flip it over and write all the things that give them joy and beauty and then put it together, but make that final twist so that it's a Mobius strip. Because it's all a part of, we really have to hold it all. And of course, as wiser voices have said, even a wounded world is healing us, even a wounded world is feeding us. So we are nourished by that living world.
Yes, yes. I think that makes sense, to really reinvigorate our connection with life as we continue to try to participate in it and contribute to its well-being, for sure.
Yeah. It's community, isn't it? I mean, and that we want to, if we're in times of grief, we want to be in human community, and it's also expanding our community to be with the living world.
I often do think that, that it's abstract and upsetting to read some measurement of environmental decline or human suffering, but then you can step outside and see all the life that is thriving right now, right around you, whether it's in a city park or a wilder place. And that's a reminder that all is not lost, and there's still a lot of space for us to be the creative, wise, and empowered beings that we can be in choosing how we go forward here.
Yeah. Yeah. And resilience. I mean, the world models resilience for us in so many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, and kind of circling back to some things we've talked about and maybe amplifying them a little bit, it seems to me that one way we can help one another right now is to try to imagine, what are we trying to create? Like, what is the goal here? It's something as kind of sterile as halting climate change. I mean, that's, it's an important goal, but I don't think that lights people up, maybe not helping us a lot. So I like to sometimes invite guests on the podcast to share their sense of what is the much more beautiful, thriving, flourishing circumstance that we're trying to create. So, Robin Wall Kimmerer refers to that as humans and nature being good medicine for each other. And Thomas Berry had so much beautiful language around that, using words like flourishing and sacred communion. But I'm curious about, what do you think this will look like? What would it be like in, say, 20 to 40 years if people can say, things are substantively better across all kinds of measurements. What comes to mind for you when I invite you to imagine that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so some of this I'm going to answer this in two ways. One is I think some of this we've talked about, what would it mean to be in community um, with other humans and the more than human world? What would it look like to be in that kind of community where we were like an old growth beech forest, where the weakest trees are not quickly dying because the other trees are sending resources to them, where those trees that are perhaps on the edge and don't have the water are still nourished because of that fungal network that is sharing resources. I mean, what would that be like? Well, there would be a change of heart there, wouldn't there? I mean, the change of heart that says, um, we flourish together, and it is not an ego-driven um, proposition, and it is not about scarcity of resources. It would move us from a me to a we, and from a scarcity to abundance, from competition to collaboration, from maybe not having to figure everything out, but to entrust the community with a collective wisdom. Um, it would change totally our way of leading. Um, and um, it would change our sense, I think, of who we are in that community. That would be that sense of what is my soul gift? SOUL, not SOLE. What is my soul gift? What have I been endowed with as a gift that I can contribute? And then to imagine us all fully living out of those unique and special gifts that we have, kind of the essence of our truest self. Um, so then I think some of the other things would take care of themselves, right? Because we would not be um, needing the uh, kinds of individual property that we need now because we don't share. Excuse me. We would not be needing to buy more to fill an empty soul. Um, we would be spending more time in the living world because that we would see that as part of our community. Now, I have no idea how to get there. And I don't think that most of us do. But I think what we're called to do is to offer, to the degree we can, what we see as stepping stones to that kind of a future. Um, and also really remember that, again, Earth has agency and wisdom beyond what we ever know, and that gives us tremendous possibilities when we trust that as a way of shaping our future.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, Leah. I really appreciate how you sketched that out. And I would simply add, I know, as you just modeled, even though few or no of us, none of us right now can really say exactly how we create that. One of the most important things for us to be doing right now is just inviting one another to feel into that, envision it, believe it, imagine it, and then collaboratively in community, see what we can build together.
Yeah. And that's why, Shara, I really want to honor what you do. And it's also why I wrote the book. I think the conversations are really the tool we have right now. How do we keep being in these conversations to encourage and support each other in this um, in this calling, really, um, to move out of our adolescence, perhaps, and into greater adulthood in our relationships.
Yes. Thank you so much, Leah. Really a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I recommend the book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. And thanks once more for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Humans and Earth. Please share this episode to broaden engagement in the regeneration our world needs. You'll find social media links in the show notes. To explore our other offerings, visit www.humansandearth.com.